President Trump was at the UN yesterday. He's at the UN today as well. He's presiding over the Security Council, and it is, in fact, deeply amusing to watch him gavel to silence the constituencies, the representatives of China, for example. He's actually sitting there with a gavel, which is pretty awesome. But he gave a speech at the UN General Assembly yesterday, and it was quite good. There was a lot there that was quite good. He said that we defend sovereignty. This was his sort of main claim. I think that this particular claim is not one of his best. And he says we defend sovereignty of other nations. And then he sort of suggests that they get to define their own values. That's true to a point, obviously. It is not true to the ultimate point, which is that you get to define how you treat your people without any sort of interference from the outside. That obviously is untrue. But here was the president making his main point, talking about America first and sovereignty.
To unleash this incredible potential in our people, we must defend the foundations that make it all possible. Sovereign and independent nations are the only vehicle where freedom has ever survived, democracy has ever endured, where peace has ever prospered. And so we must protect our sovereignty and our cherished independence above all.
So I agree with all of that, right? Everything that he just said there about nationalism actually being a good vehicle, everything there about nationalism being a good vehicle for human society, agree. And the idea of a global government where we're all brothers, a brotherhood of man, as John Lennon says in Imagine, that's a bunch of nonsense. With that said, even Trump believes that nationalism doesn't mean that sovereignty is completely left alone, right? So for example, he said this about socialism and communism. He basically said Venezuela can't run things like the Venezuelan government is currently running things. And that's a breach of Venezuelan sovereignty, I would imagine. The basic rule about Venezuela and the basic rule about nationalism is that nationalism is good so long as it follows good ends and uses good means. It is not good so long as it involves, genocide against a population, or so long as it involves socialism and communism and destruction of the rights of the individual. Here is President Trump going off about Venezuela. He's correct about this, obviously.
Virtually everywhere socialism or communism has been tried, it has produced suffering, corruption, and decay. Socialism's thirst for power leads to expansion, incursion, and oppression. All nations of the world should resist socialism and the misery that it brings to everyone. In that spirit, we ask the nations gathered here to join us in calling for the restoration of democracy in Venezuela.
Okay, so obviously when he talks about sovereignty, he only means that sovereignty applies so far as it doesn't violate sovereign human rights and individual rights, which is correct. And I think that he should make that clear in future speeches. But a lot of this was very good. And it is good to have a president who goes before the UN and doesn't make apologies for the United States. I mean, I think President Trump is at his best in international scenarios because a muscular America on the world stage defending her own interests is a very good thing for the world as a general rule. An America that goes in front of the UN and apologizes for Ferguson or Baltimore, which is what Barack Obama did in front of the UN, apologizes for American interests, apologizes for America promoting her own interests around the world, suggesting that national sovereignty of bad countries is more important than human rights or national sovereignty of good countries. That was devastating stuff. And I know there are a lot of people who say, oh, well, President Trump went there and he got laughed at by the international community. Why do you care if a second-rate dictator is laughing at you, so long as we're taking action to stop the second-rate dictator? I would much prefer that the second-rate radical Islamic dictators of Iran laugh at President Trump and feel it in their pocketbook than that they smile at President Obama and enrich themselves on the back of their own people and then use all of that money to fund terrorism. So President Trump, I thought, did a just fine job at the UN in the General Assembly yesterday. The way that he talked about Israel and Iran, I thought was just terrific. Here's what the president said with regard to Iran. It's very different language than President Obama was using just a couple of years ago.
This year, we also took another significant step forward in the Middle East in recognition of every sovereign state to determine its own capital. I moved the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. The United States is committed to a future of peace and stability in the region, including peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That aim is advanced, not harmed, by acknowledging the obvious facts.
Okay, and then what he had to say about the Israelis and Palestinians, obviously a far cry from when Barack Obama would go to the UN and suggest that all world problems were to be laid at the feet of the Jews. They were to be laid at the feet of the Israelis, who are, of course, so intransigent with regard to, the terrorist groups on their borders. And if they would only be a little nicer, that would solve the problems with regard to Iran. Now, I do like that the president's America First attitude on the world stage means that we're going to stand up to bad countries. Again, he was doing that today in the Security Council. Apparently, he said today in the Security Council that China has been attempting to interfere with our elections. He suggested that Russian interference in Syria cannot go unnoticed. All of that is very good stuff. So good for the president of the United States. More of that. More of the president speaking on international affairs in the face of countries that are pursuing evil ends. And, less of the president tweeting. I think the last several weeks for the president have actually been quite good. He's really kept himself from saying the obviously dumb thing much more frequently than usual. And that would be good. I'd like to see a continuation of that